house seemed larger than Ellie had imagined, with its windows covered in dust and the scent of old wood burned by time. An uncomfortable silence hovered in the empty rooms, but she kept reassuring herself that everything would be fine. This would be a new chance, a fresh start for her and Lily. On the second day after moving in, Ellie and Lily decided to explore the basement. The door, made of heavy old wood, creaked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. The darkness below was cold and smelled of damp earth. Little Lily, her bright eyes gleaming, ran ahead of her mother, eager for any forgotten treasure. "Look, Mommy, I found a doll," the girl shouted, holding up a grimy porcelain doll with tangled hair. Ellie frowned. Something about that doll felt unsettling, but seeing Lily's joy, she didn't have the heart to say no. The doll went upstairs with them. In the days that followed, Lily refused to part with the doll. It was as if Alice, as Lily decided to call her, had become her new best friend. Ellie tried not to worry. After all, children often get attached to toys. But there was something off about the way Lily talked to the doll. Lily no longer played with her blocks or watched her favorite shows. She spent hours sitting in her room, murmuring to Alice as if they were sharing secrets. "Alice told me this house is really old," Lily would say, in a tone that didn't sound like a child's. Day by day, the doll seemed more present, almost alive in her daughter's room. Ellie began to notice other things too. At night, there were soft footsteps echoing through the house as if someone was walking barefoot. She checked Lily's room, but the girl was always sound asleep, with Alice nestled by her side. One morning, as Ellie went to wake Lily, she felt a chill when she noticed the doll had changed position. It was now sitting upright on the bed, facing the door, as if waiting for her. A knot formed in Ellie's stomach. The scent of damp earth seemed to have crept up from the basement, spreading throughout the house. That night, Ellie woke to a strange sound. Soft giggles drifted from Lily's room, followed by muffled whispers. A wave of cold ran through her body. She glanced at the clock. 3:03 a.m. With her heart racing, she walked down the hall to her daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, and in the dim light, Ellie saw Lily sitting on the bed, hugging the doll and whispering something incomprehensible. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked, her throat tightening. Lily slowly turned, her eyes almost vacant. "Alice said she doesn't want you to take her away," she murmured, clutching the doll tightly. Ellie reached out to grab Alice, but Lily screamed wildly, as if something had taken control of her. "You can't take her away from me." Ellie recoiled, frightened. The room light flickered, and for a brief moment she swore she saw the reflection of an unfamiliar child in the doll's glassy eyes. The next morning, the doll was back in the room, despite Ellie being certain she had left it in the basement. Ellie's nights turned into torment. As soon as she closed her eyes, she was plunged into vivid nightmares. In the most recurring one, she was in the basement, digging into the ground with her bare hands. She could feel the cold, damp soil gathering under her nails as she frantically dug, knowing she had to find something, or someone. Eventually, her fingers touched a small skull. Ellie would always wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding and her fingers aching. Even awake, she could feel the gritty texture of dirt beneath her nails, though her hands were clean. She began avoiding the basement, but the smell of damp earth followed her everywhere, clinging to everything. During the day, Lily grew increasingly distant. When Ellie tried to talk to her daughter, Lily would respond with unsettling remarks. "Alice knows what you did, Mommy," she said one afternoon, without even looking at her. Ellie began questioning her sanity. Was she losing her mind, or was something in the house trying to break her? Ellie couldn't take it anymore. The voices in the dark, the suffocating dreams, and Lily's behavior were driving her to the edge. One night, consumed by desperation, she decided she had to end it once and for all. Grabbing a shovel, she headed to the basement, driven by a need she didn't fully understand. The smell of damp earth was stronger there, thick and almost nauseating. The light bulb flickered, casting shaky shadows on the walls. Ellie started digging in the center of the basement, every strike of the shovel against the soil heightening her anxiety, as if she knew she was about to uncover something terrible. She dug frantically, gripped by an inexplicable urgency. With every layer of earth she removed, the light flickered more, almost going out. Suddenly, the shovel hit something solid. Ellie dropped to her knees, scooping away the dirt with her hands until she finally saw it. They were small human bones, yellowed with age, mixed with remnants of children's clothing. Her stomach churned, but then she found something even more disturbing. Human teeth, identical to the ones in Alice's porcelain mouth. Before she could react, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Ellie turned and saw Lily standing at the top of the stairs, smiling strangely. Her eyes were no longer the same. There was something cold and empty in them. "Alice told me you'll never leave us," Lily said, her voice not her own. Ellie sank to the basement floor, pulling her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth. The doll was in her arms, cold as marble, as she clutched it tightly to her chest. The smell of damp earth clung to her skin and thoughts. Lily stood silently on the stairs as if waiting for something. Alice's voice whispered softly in Ellie's mind, promising that they would never be alone again. The basement's darkness wrapped around her like a mist, smothering any last trace of reason. She began to hum a lullaby, rocking the doll. Now they were one. Megan held Winston, her cat, in her arms, trying to calm him down. He had never liked the basement, but over the past few weeks, his behavior had changed drastically. The animal now refused to even approach the wooden door leading to the lower floor. Every time she tried to carry him down there, he scratched her skin fiercely, as if something terrible awaited him in the darkness below. "Again, Megan?" Her father grumbled, holding his belt and adjusting his glasses on his nose. "You know he can't stay around the house. For God's sake, it's just a basement." She nodded reluctantly and went down alone, the distressed meows of Winston echoing behind her. The basement was large and gloomy, with damp walls and old furniture covered in dust. The dim light flickered with an annoying buzz. Megan glanced toward the far corner where an old storm door was secured with a rusty padlock. There was something unsettling about that corner. It felt like the air around it was heavy and suffocating, worsening night by night. She shut the door behind her and ran up the stairs, desperate to shake off the sensation of being watched. In the following nights, Winston's condition worsened. He whimpered softly and crawled under the bed as if trying to disappear. Megan woke several times in the dead of night, hearing the creak of wooden floors under soft footsteps. One night, a shadow appeared at her bedroom door. "Dad?" she called out in a trembling voice. The silhouette stood still for a few seconds, then dissolved into the darkness, making no sound at all. Megan froze, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally gathered the courage to get up, she peeked into the hallway, but it was empty. Only the basement door was wide open, swaying gently as if someone had just walked through it. The next morning, Megan tried to tell her mother what she had seen, but her mother only gave her a skeptical smile. "You've been watching too much TV, sweetheart." Things worsened as days went by. Objects began to disappear. Small things like brushes, glasses, and phone chargers. Nights became endless. Megan would wake up gasping for air, feeling as though someone had whispered her name. Winston spent the entire day hiding under the couch, growling at nothing. One cold October afternoon, Megan decided to go down to the basement alone. Her father kept insisting that the doors were always locked, and the key to the storm entrance was safely stored. "There's no way anyone's getting in," he repeated. Still, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something lived in that darkness, something drawing closer to her every day. Armed with a flashlight, she descended the creaky stairs, the air growing denser and more humid with each step. The metallic, acrid scent from the basement's depths intensified, as if something was slowly rotting. When she reached the bottom step, she heard a strange sound, a broken, wheezing breath, like someone struggling to breathe. The flashlight flickered and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned to look back, but it was already too late. Megan swung the flashlight toward the sound, and the faint beam wavered over the storm door. It was ajar. The padlock, which always seemed intact, now dangled loosely on the chain. A cold draft slipped through the gap, making her shiver. But what truly stole her breath was what the light revealed at the entrance. A pale, emaciated figure crouched in the corner, its eyes so sunken they seemed to have no bottom. It was a man, or what remained of one. His frail body was bent unnaturally, with bones protruding under grayish skin. Each breath came out as a sickly, wet rasp, as though his lungs were filling with fluid. She wanted to scream, but her throat tightened. From upstairs, Winston began meowing frantically, sensing the danger his owner faced. The figure shifted slightly, tilting its head as if listening to something distant. When Megan took a step back, it gave her a grotesque smile, revealing rotten teeth and blackened gums. "I didn't mean to scare you," the man whispered, his voice broken and secretive. "They said I could stay. They said you wouldn't mind." Megan shook her head in disbelief. "They? Who were they? Who told you that? She whispered, her voice faltering. The answer didn't come immediately. Instead, the man began to laugh quietly, a sound like nails scraping against rusted metal. His eyes widened suddenly as if he had noticed something entering the room. He looked past Megan and his expression turned to pure terror. She froze. Something was behind her. Megan couldn't move. The air grew heavier, oppressive. A dark shadow slowly crept into her peripheral vision. It had no defined shape. A dense, pulsating mass like living smoke. The sensation of emptiness and cold spread through her, and a distant, raspy voice whispered in her ear, "Finally." The flashlight slipped from Megan's trembling hands, clattering to the floor and plunging the room into suffocating darkness. She felt something approaching. Not the man, but something else. Something inhuman now with her. She ran. She didn't look back, not wanting to know what followed. The stairs seemed endless, each step groaning as if about to collapse. Footsteps echoed behind her. Not just hers, but something else chasing her, getting closer. At the top, she slammed the basement door shut and locked it, panting, her heart ready to burst. Winston stood in the hallway, fur bristling, eyes fixed on the newly locked door. The cat let out a low, warning meow. "It's okay, Winston," Megan whispered, trying to convince herself, but it wasn't. She knew the basement wasn't done with her. Over the following days, things worsened. The voice from the basement didn't stay there. Now she heard it everywhere. Sometimes, while brushing her teeth, whispers emerged behind her in the mirror. Other times, the basement door creaked, even though it was locked. The worst part was at night. Megan woke up at 3 a.m., suffocating under the weight of someone standing by her bed watching her. Her parents insisted it was stress. "You're imagining things," they said, weary of her complaints. But Megan knew she wasn't alone. Scratch marks began to appear under the basement door, long and deep, as if something or someone was trying to escape. Objects continued to vanish. Winston's once shiny white fur started falling out, leaving bald patches across his body. On the final night, the inevitable happened. Megan woke to the crushing weight of something on her chest, suffocating her. She opened her eyes and saw the shadow. Now solid and clear, it pressed her into the mattress, stealing her breath. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. All she heard was the same cold whisper, "Now you are ours." And then, everything went dark. Megan's parents found her room empty the next morning. The bed was neatly made, and the only thing out of place was the basement door. Wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze, Winston lay curled up in the hallway, letting out a low, ominous purr, as if he never wanted to enter that room again. Megan was never seen again. The police were called at dawn. For hours, officers searched the house and scoured every inch of the basement. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No clues to her whereabouts. Only the strange metallic odor lingered in the air, coming from the depths of the basement. The same scent Megan had smelled that night. The case was ruled as an unexplained disappearance, though everyone knew something far more sinister had occurred. 3 weeks later, Megan's father, Tom, went down to the basement alone. Something had gnawed at him since that night. He needed to see the place again. To be sure the shadow his daughter feared wasn't just in her imagination. His flashlight trembled in his hand, the air even thicker than before. As he explored the dark corners, he noticed the storm door was ajar once more. The padlock dangled loosely, too rusted for anyone to have tampered with it recently. That's when he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A narrow, hidden opening beneath a pile of old boards. Tom removed the boards, and the stench intensified. Something was down there. He shined his flashlight into the opening. There lay Megan's twisted, pale body, her eyes wide with frozen terror. But she wasn't alone. Wrapped around her was a dark, amorphous figure like a snake made of smoke. It pulsed slowly, almost alive, and then it shifted slightly, noticing Tom's presence. Before he could react, a deep whisper invaded his mind. She was never alone, and now, neither are you. The darkness began to rise, flowing toward him like a slow tide. Tom tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. An unbearable cold enveloped him, freezing him in place. The darkness consumed him, pressing down on his chest as if 1,000 invisible hands dragged him into the abyss. He tried to scream, but the air escaped him, and then there was only silence. Weeks later, the house went up for sale. The family was never seen again, and the police couldn't explain Megan's or her parents' disappearance. Winston, the cat, was found wandering the neighborhood alone. The house remained vacant for months until a childless couple moved in. On their first night, as they unpacked and explored their new home, the basement caught their attention. Curious, they opened the door and smelled the damp, metallic scent rising from the depths. Something about the space unsettled them, though they couldn't say why. The man smiled at his wife, trying to brush it off. Just an old basement. Nothing to worry about. That night, as they slept, a door somewhere in the house creaked open, and from the darkness below, a pair of eyes gleamed, waiting patiently for their next victim. Michael Ford arrived in the small town of East Hollow, Pennsylvania, intending to rebuild his life. After years surrounded by urban chaos and the emotional wreckage of a failed relationship, he believed this move would be the fresh start he so desperately needed. The house he had found was old and weather-worn, but there was something about it that seemed to call out to him. It was a forgotten, quiet place. Exactly what he wanted. A chance to escape his past. But from the very first day, a nagging feeling followed him. The silence in the house was too deep, almost oppressive, as if each wall were waiting for something to happen. In the empty hallways and rooms, the air felt stagnant and heavy, and Michael found himself staring out the windows for no reason, as if expecting to see something on the other side. That night, around 2 a.m, he was awakened by soft knocks at the front door. Groggy, it took him a few seconds to process the sound. At first, he thought it might be an animal, maybe a branch tapping against the frame, but the sound repeated, 3 short, precise knocks. Michael got out of bed, feeling the cold of the old wood beneath his bare feet, and walked to the door. He peered through the peephole. 2 figures stood outside. They were completely still. They looked human, or at least they seemed human, but something was terribly wrong with them. Their faces were smooth, like statues, except for the wide, unmoving smiles they wore, and the most disturbing detail: they had no eyes, just empty sockets where their eyeballs should have been. Then one of the figures spoke in a soft and polite voice. "Let us in, please. Just for one night, we won't do any harm." Michael instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he stood frozen, trying to comprehend what he had just seen and heard. The voice sounded kind, even cordial, but there was something profoundly wrong in those words. A cold, hollow tone, as if it were just a clumsy imitation of humanity. The air in the house felt heavier, and a creeping sense of panic crawled over Michael's skin. He didn't respond. He stood still, holding his breath, hoping they would go away. But the visitors didn't move. They remained motionless on the porch, their rigid, lifeless smiles unchanged, as if they could wait forever. Hours passed, and the silence was broken only by the faint wind outside. Michael remained standing, holding his breath every time the floorboards creaked. Finally, just before dawn, the figures simply turned and disappeared into the darkness without a sound. The next day, he tried to go about his routine. He went out to buy groceries and exchanged small talk with the neighbors. No one seemed surprised to see him, but he felt their lingering glances, as if they all knew something he didn't. When he asked about the previous owner of the house, the answers were vague. One neighbor muttered, "Sometimes some doors shouldn't be opened." That same night, the knocking returned. Now 3 figures stood waiting on the porch. Michael gripped the door handle tightly, trying to stay composed, but fear choked him. "Please," one of them said with the same neutral voice from the night before. "It's cold out here. Let us in." Michael didn't answer. He locked the door twice and waited, watching the shadows linger there like unmoving sentinels. With every passing second, he became more certain that these beings were not human. The hours dragged on, and finally they left, but Michael knew they would return. And the worst part? He couldn't stop thinking about them. In the following days, Michael withdrew more and more. The obsession with the visitors grew like a plague in his mind. He stopped answering messages, ignored phone calls, and avoided making eye contact with anyone he met. The feeling that the neighbors knew something he didn't made everything more oppressive. It was as if he were trapped in a play where everyone but him knew the script. The nights were worse. When the figures didn't show up, he dreamed about them. In the nightmares, he opened the door and the visitors touched his face. Their touch was cold and empty, as if their skin was dead, yet it demanded something from him, as if they were trying to steal a part of his soul. When he woke up, the sensation of having been touched lingered, and he found himself compulsively washing his face in the kitchen sink. The black ribbon was the first sign that something truly strange was happening. He found it tied to a branch in the yard, swaying in the wind like a grim reminder. Michael didn't remember placing it there, but the ribbon seemed important. In the days that followed, it continued to appear in different places inside the house. On the stair railing, on the mirror's frame, even tied to the front door. Every time he found it, he felt a knot in his stomach. The sound of knocking at the door became the only thing keeping him awake. He waited for it as one waits for an inevitable storm. He couldn't explain why, but part of him wanted to open the door just to discover who or what these visitors were. Then on a cold, silent night, the knocking returned. 4 figures now waited outside. Their clothes were even dirtier and more worn, and their smiles remained as fixed as before. Michael clutched the doorknob, his heart racing. With every knock, the urge to open the door grew like an insatiable hunger. "Let us in, just for one night." He didn't open it, but in that moment he knew he wouldn't resist much longer. The next night, a heavy rain battered East Hollow. Michael sat in front of the door waiting for them. He knew they would return. He felt it deep in his chest, as if an invisible bond tied him to those figures. Every tick of the clock on the wall sounded like a countdown to an inevitable encounter. At 2 a.m., the knocks came. 4 figures stood there, their bodies still, their faces sculpted into rigid smiles. Rain streamed down their tattered clothes, but they didn't seem to care. They waited patiently, as if time held no meaning for them. This time, Michael didn't hesitate for long. It felt as if all his will had drained away, as if resisting was futile. Opening the door didn't just seem inevitable, it felt necessary. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and turned the knob. It opened without resistance. The figures entered slowly, one by one, without saying a word. The only thing Michael felt was a terrible weight, as if something invisible had settled in his chest. As the visitors passed by him, Michael realized the most terrifying thing. They didn't have real bodies. They were just empty shells, shadows wearing human appearances as masks. And the moment they entered, something from them seeped into Michael. A cold, ancient presence that spread through every part of him. Then the door clicked shut behind them and the house suddenly felt quieter than ever. In the days that followed, Michael noticed something fundamental had changed within him. Small, everyday tasks, like brushing his teeth or making coffee, now felt empty, devoid of meaning. Each action was performed automatically, as if he were watching himself from the outside, a spectator of his own life. His thoughts were no longer his own. Sometimes a strange voice whispered odd things in his mind, a voice he didn't recognize. Other times he found his hands moving on their own, placing the black ribbon in new places around the house. The eyes in the mirror no longer belonged to him, and when he smiled, it was the same crooked, lifeless smile he had seen on the visitors. Michael knew he was no longer the same. Something from them had infiltrated his being, dissolving his very self bit by bit, like sand carried away by an invisible wind. He tried to resist, but it was like fighting against the tide of a dark, relentless ocean. On the final night, feeling what little remained of himself slipping away, Michael grabbed his camera and recorded his final confession. His eyes were sunken, and there was something terribly wrong in his expression. "If you hear the knocking, don't open the door," he murmured to the camera. "Never open it." He paused, staring directly into the lens. Darkness seemed to envelop his figure, and then, slowly, he smiled. A familiar, empty, sinister smile. His eyes were completely hollow, just like the visitors. The video ended with a soft click and the distant sound of laughter, as if many voices were laughing at once, echoing from the depths of an endless void.